Born to rule the Kingdom of Serbia, Crown Prince George was instead deliberately erased by history. His throne was stripped away not just because of his ruthlessly violent nature, but due to the dark secrets his royal family desperately sought to bury, a bloody murder committed by his own hands, and a forbidden homosexual romance with a commoner mathematician. From a decorated war hero charging on the front lines, he was ultimately usurped by his own brother and locked away in an insane asylum for 16 years. The year 1887 brought another child into a family already suffocating under the heavy, silent weight of exile. Born on the 27th of August in the rugged terrain of Cetinje, Montenegro, George was the eldest son of Peter I, the Karađorđević dynasty. For nearly 3 decades, his family had been banished from their homeland, treated as political ghosts wandering Europe, while their bitter rivals, the Obrenović dynasty, held an iron grip over the Serbian throne. This was not a childhood cushioned by silken sheets, vast estates, or fawning courtiers. It was a harsh existence defined by displacement, watching his father gaze eastward toward a kingdom that had violently rejected them. The reality of their precarious position, living on the charity of foreign powers, and the fading hope of a royal restoration hardened the young boy early. Tragedy compounded the deep isolation of their exile. When George was merely 2 years old, his mother, Princess Zorka, died. The sudden loss stripped the family of its matriarch and deepened the austere silence in their home. Seeking stability, Peter moved his motherless children to Geneva, Switzerland. There, George spent his formative years in a quiet, strictly managed environment, a stark contrast to the grand, opulent palaces of the ruling European monarchs. But the quiet safety of Geneva was only temporary. The boy needed to be forged into a weapon, a capable leader who could one day reclaim a stolen crown and survive the brutal political landscape of the Balkans. His father sent him to Russia, depositing the young prince into the relentless machinery of the Page Corps in St. Petersburg. This was the most prestigious and brutal military academy of Tsar Alexander II, designed to mold the sons of Russian nobility into hardened officers. The stone walls of the academy did not care about a boy's royal blood or his tragic past. They cared only about discipline, physical endurance, and absolute submission to the chain of command. George was subjected to freezing drills in the Russian winter, rigid hierarchical abuse, and an education designed to strip away hesitation and leave only cold military precision. It was a harsh environment that cultivated his immense physical strength, but also aggravated a volatile, fiercely independent, and explosive temperament that chafed aggressively against any form of authority. Despite their exiled status and the hardships they endured, the Karađorđević bloodline was formidable, woven tightly into the apex of European power. This was a family that intimately understood the currency of strategic marriage. The web of alliances they cultivated would soon bridge the gap between the rugged, war-torn Balkans and the zenith of global empire. George's younger brother, Alexander, would eventually marry Princess Maria of Romania. Maria was no minor noble. She was the daughter of Queen Marie of Romania, who stood as a direct granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria. This deliberate, highly strategic union meant that Crown Prince George was the brother-in-law to the great-granddaughter of the British matriarch. The blood of the British royal family ran adjacent to the exiled Serbian princes, providing an unspoken guarantee of their legitimacy and establishing a powerful network of influence across the continent. The endless waiting and the quiet desperation of exile shattered violently in the spring of 1903. The politics of the Balkans had always been settled with steel, and the ruling Obrenović dynasty had exhausted its mandate with the military and the people. In a meticulously planned and horrifyingly bloody military coup, a faction of Serbian army officers stormed the royal palace in Belgrade in the dead of night. The ruling King Alexander I and Queen Draga were not merely deposed, they were hunted down within the dark corridors of their own halls, assassinated in a frenzy of gunfire and sabers, and their mutilated bodies were thrown from the palace windows into the courtyard below. The rival dynasty was extinguished in a single, brutal night of slaughter. With the throne suddenly empty and the palace floors still stained with the blood of their rivals, the military government sent urgent word to Geneva. Peter I was recalled from the shadows of exile and crowned King of Serbia. At just 17 years old, George stepped off a train in Belgrade, leaving behind the cold, rigid discipline of the Russian military academy and the quiet obscurity of Switzerland. He walked into a capital still reeling from a regicide and was immediately elevated to the position of crown prince. The young man who had grown up an outsider, a forgotten cadet in a foreign land, was now the rightful heir to the Kingdom of Serbia. He was thrust instantly into the glaring, unforgiving spotlight of court politics, foreign espionage, and intense public scrutiny. The crown was finally within his grasp, but the sudden, violent transition from an exiled soldier to the heir apparent of a volatile kingdom set the stage for a life defined not by steady governance, but by unprecedented scandal, forbidden passions, and ultimate tragedy. The transition from a nameless cadet to the crown prince of Serbia was not a liberation. It was an incarceration behind gilded bars. The royal palace in Belgrade, newly scrubbed of the Obrenović blood, was a suffocating environment of paranoid ministers, sycophantic courtiers, and archaic protocols. For George, whose entire youth had been defined by the biting cold of the Russian military and the blunt camaraderie of the barracks, the sudden expectation to navigate the treacherous, velvet-draped halls of diplomacy was paralyzing. He was a soldier forced into a silk collar. The government and his father, King Peter I, quickly realized the untamed prince needed refinement. He required an education that extended beyond cavalry charges and infantry tactics. He needed to understand the mechanics of statecraft, the logic of the modern world, and the precise calculations required to rule a volatile nation. The man chosen to tame the crown prince was not a hardened general or a cunning diplomat. He was Mihailo Petrovich. Known to the streets and the docks of Belgrade simply as Mika Alas, Petrovich was a towering intellect of the era. He was a mathematician of terrifying brilliance who had walked the hallowed halls of the Sorbonne in Paris, earning his doctorate under the direct supervision of scientific titans like Henri Poincaré and Charles Hermite. To the Serbian court, hiring Petrovich was a calculated move to inject European enlightenment directly into the veins of the royal heir. They expected the professor to instill cold logic and rigid discipline into the erratic prince through the universal language of mathematics. They fundamentally misunderstood both men. The collision of the crown prince and the mathematician did not produce a disciplined future monarch. It ignited a profound, life-altering rebellion. From the very first hour they spent together, the rigid walls of academic instruction and courtly protocol collapsed entirely. George, seething with resentment at his confined existence, openly despised the dusty textbooks and the suffocating air of the royal study. Instead of enforcing discipline or reporting the prince's insolence to the king, Mika Alas studied the angry young man before him. He recognized a caged animal. Without a word of reprimand, the brilliant mathematician closed the textbooks, stood up, and instructed the future king of Serbia to follow him out the door. They left the palace behind. Instead of a library, Mika Alas led the prince down to the muddy, chaotic banks of the river Sava. Mika Alas possessed a dual identity that baffled the aristocratic elite. In the lecture halls, he was a peerless academic, but on the river he was a savage force of nature. His nickname, Alas, translated directly to river fisherman. He viewed the grueling physical labor of pulling heavy nets from the freezing currents of the Sava and the Danube not as a hobby, but as a religion. Down in the mud, surrounded by the rough, calloused hands of the working class, Mika Alas introduced the crown prince to absolute freedom. He taught George how to read the currents, how to mend a torn net, and how to wait in absolute silence for a catch. The relationship that forged on those riverbanks was instantaneous and deep. They found a violent harmony in the grueling physical exertion of the outdoors. They established a fencing club in the heart of Belgrade, trading brutal strikes and sweat, stripping away the titles of prince and professor, until they were simply two men testing each other's limits. For George, Mika Alas became the solitary anchor in a world that had suddenly spiraled out of his control. The mathematician treated him not as a fragile piece of state property, but as an equal. This intense, exclusive companionship did not go unnoticed. A crown prince cannot disappear into the slums of the Savamala docks for days on end without triggering a crisis of state. The sight of the heir to the throne, covered in river mud and smelling of raw fish, marching side by side with a bohemian professor, sent shockwaves through the conservative court. King Peter I was a pragmatist who understood the fragile nature of his newly acquired crown. He summoned his son and delivered a cold, brutal warning. The king made it clear that while recreational fishing was an acceptable diversion for a monarch, living like a vagrant with a commoner was a severe dereliction of duty. The public, the military, and the hostile empires surrounding Serbia were watching. Every action was being scrutinized, and George was failing the test of optics. But the concerns of the king were not merely about mud on royal boots. The court was rotting with venomous rumors. The true nature of the bond between the crown prince and Mika Alas became the subject of intense, vicious speculation. Official state historians and panicked courtiers desperately tried to frame the relationship as a noble platonic brotherhood, a classical mentorship between a young ruler and a wise philosopher. The reality discussed in the hushed corridors and the sensationalist press was entirely different. Whispers of a scandalous, deeply intimate relationship between the prince and the mathematician began to hemorrhage from the palace. While modern historians still debate the exact nature of their bond, political rivals weaponized these rumors, framing their bohemian friendship as a forbidden romance to undermine George's legitimacy. It was quietly circulated among the highest levels of the government that King Peter I had broken down in the presence of his closest advisors, expressing utter despair and fury over the physical reality of his son's relationship with Petrovich. The pressure from the state became crushing. In a desperate bid to protect George from the mounting political fallout and the threat of severe royal sanction, Mika Alas made a calculated sacrifice. He intentionally deepened his bohemian persona, moving further away from the respectable circles of Belgrade society and immersing himself entirely in the rough, impoverished world of the rivermen. He created a physical distance to satisfy the paranoid court, deliberately ruining his own social standing to shield the prince. Yet, the tether between them never snapped. When the political walls of the palace closed in, and George's explosive temper threatened to destroy his own life, the Danube River remained his only sanctuary. He would repeatedly break protocol, fleeing the gilded halls in the dead of night to find Mika Alas huddled in the freezing, dilapidated huts of the fishermen. Decades later, long after the crown was gone and his life lay in ruins, George would write about these moments with a raw, bleeding honesty. He recounted the night he finally lost everything, fleeing to the river in absolute disgrace. Mika Alas was waiting for him. The mathematician did not offer empty platitudes or feign shock. He sat in total silence beside the broken prince, and resting quietly on the lapel of Mika's worn coat was the exact ink pen George had used to sign the document renouncing his throne. It was a silent, defiant declaration of absolute loyalty. A vow that while the state could strip George of his kingdom, it could never touch the bond they had forged in the mud of the Sava. But this sanctuary could not last. The volatile temper that Mika Alas tried so desperately to soothe on the river was about to detonate inside the palace walls, and the resulting blood would stain the Karađorđević dynasty forever. The winter of 1909 descended upon Belgrade with a bitter, freezing finality, locking the city in ice and effectively cutting George off from his sanctuary on the river. Forced indoors, trapped within the claustrophobic, velvet-lined corridors of the royal palace, the crown prince was separated from the grounding influence of Mika Alas. Deprived of the exhausting physical labor and the quiet, non-judgmental companionship of the mathematician, George's psyche began to fracture. The palace was a pressure cooker of political paranoia. Serbia was locked in a terrifying standoff with the Austro-Hungarian Empire over the annexation of Bosnia, and the halls buzzed with the frantic, terrified whispers of ministers preparing for a war they knew they could not win. George, possessing a militant, aggressive temperament forged in the Russian academies, violently clashed with the cautious diplomacy of his father's government. He felt caged by his duties, alienated by his family, and hunted by the relentless rumors surrounding his sexuality. This toxic cocktail of extreme political stress, enforced isolation, and internal rage required only the slightest spark to detonate. That spark materialized in the form of his personal servant, Stevan Kolaković. Kolaković was not merely a faceless attendant, blending into the background of the royal household. As the crown prince's personal valet, he operated within the most intimate, heavily guarded spheres of George's daily existence. He dressed the prince, managed his private quarters, and acted as a gatekeeper to his most closely held secrets. In the hothouse environment of the royal court, where every glance was analyzed and every locked door sparked a dozen rumors, the exact nature of the relationship between George and Kolaković became dangerously blurred. Whispers circulated among the palace guards and the lesser nobility that the servant was not just an employee, but a secret lover, entangled in the chaotic, deeply hidden romantic life of the prince. Whether this was the absolute truth or merely a symptom of the court's obsession with George's sexuality, the reality remained that Kolaković held immense power simply by virtue of his proximity. He knew too much. He saw the prince not as a symbol of the state, but as a deeply flawed, volatile man, and navigating the emotional landscape of Crown Prince George was a lethal occupation. The breaking point arrived in the dead of night, in the early hours of February 28, 1909. History has obscured the exact words that were exchanged in the suffocating privacy of the prince's chambers. Some historical accounts suggest a fit of blinding jealousy, a lover's quarrel that spiraled violently out of control. Others point to a perceived act of insubordination that triggered the prince's military-bred demand for absolute obedience. The catalyst mattered little compared to the sheer, catastrophic brutality of the response. Driven by uncontrollable rage, George unleashed the full extent of his physical strength on the unarmed servant. The heavy, muscular frame that had been hardened by years of Russian military drills and days spent hauling river nets was weaponized against an unarmed man. George brutally and repeatedly punched Kolaković in the face and skull. When the servant collapsed to the floor, the assault did not cease. In a state of total, unhinged fury, the crown prince delivered a series of devastating, heavy-booted kicks directly into Kolaković's lower abdomen. The sheer force of the blows was designed to break, to crush, and to punish. When the assault ceased, the crown prince of Serbia was standing over a man who was rapidly bleeding to death internally. Panic, cold and absolute, swept through the prince's quarters. The royal guards were summoned, not to arrest a violent assailant, but to manage a crisis of state. Kolaković, slipping in and out of consciousness and writhing in absolute agony, was hurriedly smuggled out of the palace under the cover of darkness and rushed to the state hospital in Belgrade. The royal apparatus immediately sprang into action, formulating a desperate, flimsy alibi. To protect the prince, the terrified, dying servant was instructed to lie. When the doctors at the hospital demanded to know what had caused such catastrophic injuries, Kolaković, displaying a tragic, final act of loyalty, or perhaps acting under the threat of further retaliation against his family, gasped that he had simply lost his footing and fallen down a steep flight of stairs. The medical staff at the state hospital were not fools. They examined the shattered face and the deeply bruised, rigid abdomen of the royal servant. A standard fall down a staircase produces broken limbs, perhaps a fractured collarbone or a concussion. The medical staff documented the unmistakable signature of a severe, prolonged beating, massive internal hemorrhaging, and ruptured organs caused by extreme blunt force trauma. Yet, with the menacing presence of the royal guard hovering in the hospital corridors, the physicians documented the official lie, fully aware they were watching a man die to protect the crown. For days, Karađorđević lingered in excruciating pain. His internal organs were ruptured, and massive hemorrhaging was slowly suffocating his life from the inside out. As his body deteriorated, so too did his willingness to protect the man who had destroyed him. Karađorđević realized that no royal decree and no amount of loyalty could reverse the absolute certainty of his impending death. He was going to die in a sterile hospital bed, carrying the secret of a royal murderer to the grave, while the prince remained untouched behind palace walls. Around the 6th of March, sensing the end was hours away, Karađorđević broke the silence. He pulled the attending physicians close and delivered a harrowing deathbed confession. He explicitly retracted the story of the stairs. He detailed the assault, naming Crown Prince George as his executioner. He recounted the punches, the kicks, and the blinding rage of the future king. Hours later, Stefan Karađorđević died. The subsequent autopsy shattered the palace's fragile alibi entirely. The medical examiners, despite the immense political pressure bearing down upon them, could not hide the physical evidence. The official report confirmed that Karađorđević's death was the direct result of severe internal bleeding and ruptured organs caused by extreme blunt force trauma. The medical conclusion was unequivocal. This was a brutal homicide. The walls were closing in on George. The death of his servant could no longer be contained within the silent corridors of the hospital. Recognizing that the truth was bleeding out, George made a desperate, highly incriminating move. Around the 16th of March, he penned a letter to Prime Minister Stojan Novaković. In this extraordinary document, the Crown Prince of Serbia officially admitted to the physical violence. He did not ask for forgiveness, nor did he express profound remorse for extinguishing a human life. Instead, he attempted to excuse the sheer barbarity of the act by framing it as a momentary lapse of control, claiming he had simply acted in a state of extreme agitation. He expected the government to accept this justification. He expected his royal blood to grant him absolute immunity from the consequences of murder. This terrifying sense of impunity did not emerge in a vacuum. The murder of Karađorđević was not an isolated aberration. It was the fatal climax of a long-established pattern of violent, uncontrollable behavior. The government and the royal court were acutely aware that George was a highly dangerous individual. In the secret files of the state, there was already the buried record of Colonel Draško Vasić. Vasić had been a decorated military officer who made the fatal mistake of attempting to intervene in George's chaotic personal affairs, reportedly advising the prince against his deeply controversial romantic entanglements. George, intolerant of any interference, had physically attacked the colonel. He beat the military officer with such ferocity that Vasić, who suffered from a pre-existing heart condition, went into cardiac failure and died shortly after the assault. The state had managed to sweep the colonel's death under the rug, attributing it solely to natural causes and ignoring the brutal beating that triggered it. George had killed before, and the state had taught him that his violence carried no consequences. But Stefan Karađorđević was different. The death of the colonel had been kept quiet, a military matter handled internally. The murder of the servant was too messy, too prolonged, and too documented. The autopsy report existed. The deathbed confession had been heard by civilian doctors. And most dangerously, the whispers were no longer confined to the palace. The Serbian government, led by Prime Minister Nikola Pašić, stared into the abyss. They were harboring a homicidal prince during the most fragile political moment in the nation's modern history. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was looking for any excuse to crush Serbia, and the Crown Prince had just handed them a monumental international scandal. The state machinery previously used to protect George now had to decide whether the heir to the throne was worth the survival of the entire kingdom. The cover-up was about to escalate from a desperate palace lie into a massive, heavily funded operation of state-sponsored corruption. The machinery of the Serbian state did not mobilize to seek justice for a murdered citizen. It mobilized to protect the crown from the consequences of its own bloodlust. Prime Minister Nikola Pasic, a shrewd and utterly ruthless political operator, understood that the survival of the Karađorđević dynasty, and by extension the stability of the entire nation, depended on completely obliterating the truth of Stevan Kolakovic's death. The state apparatus swung into action, executing a cover-up characterized by cold, transactional efficiency. There would be no police investigation, no royal tribunal, and certainly no criminal charges brought against the heir to the throne. The absolute impunity of the royal class was enforced with an iron fist. To silence the most immediate threat, the royal family deployed the simplest and most effective weapon in their arsenal: state funds. Kolaković had left behind a widow, Anka, who was suddenly thrust into the center of a lethal political conspiracy. The palace did not offer her a public apology or an admission of guilt. Instead, they offered a highly classified, heavily guarded financial arrangement. The royal household secretly agreed to pay a substantial pension to the widow, covering her daily living expenses, her medical bills, and the entirety of her husband's funeral costs. This was not an act of royal charity. It was hush money, paid out of the state coffers, designed to purchase Anka's absolute silence. The payments were structured to last indefinitely, quietly continuing month after month, decade after decade, stretching well into the late 1930s. The Serbian government essentially put a murder victim's widow on the state payroll to prevent her from speaking the name of the man who had beaten her husband to death. But the state could not buy the silence of the streets. The hospital where Kolaković made his dying confession was a porous environment. Nurses whispered, doctors confided in their families, and lower-level clerks leaked documents. Despite the government's desperate attempts to seal the palace doors, the horrific details of the beating hemorrhaged into the public domain. The left-wing press in Serbia, historically hostile to the monarchy and eager to expose royal corruption, seized upon the rumors. They began publishing thinly veiled accusations, demanding transparency regarding the sudden, violent death of the prince's servant. The scandal rapidly breached the borders of the Balkans. International news syndicates, hungry for tales of royal savagery, picked up the scent. Major global publications, including the New York Times, began running damning reports detailing the extreme brutality of the Serbian crown prince. George was no longer just a domestic liability. He had become a monstrous caricature on the global stage. This media firestorm struck at the absolute worst possible moment in Serbian history. The nation was locked in a terrifying existential crisis with the Austro-Hungarian Empire over the sudden annexation of Bosnia. The geopolitical atmosphere was so highly combustible that a single diplomatic misstep could trigger a full-scale invasion of Serbia by one of the largest armies in Europe. Prime Minister Pasic and the parliament were desperately trying to navigate this crisis, negotiating for the very survival of the kingdom. In the midst of this delicate life-or-death diplomacy, Crown Prince George was acting as a rogue provocateur. Possessing a fiery, aggressive nationalism and a total lack of political restraint, George had been standing in public squares, delivering highly inflammatory, warmongering speeches. He openly agitated for an immediate, armed conflict against Austria-Hungary, actively trying to incite the Serbian public into a suicidal war. The government watched in absolute horror. They knew the Serbian military would be annihilated in a direct confrontation with the Austro-Hungarian war machine. The Prime Minister realized that the Crown Prince was not just a murderer, he was an existential threat to the nation. If Austria-Hungary needed a pretext to invade, George was actively handing it to them on a silver platter. The political calculus in Belgrade shifted overnight. The parliament, the military command, and even King Peter I reached a silent, chilling consensus. George could not inherit the throne. His violent temperament, his public scandals, his hidden, fiercely guarded private life with the mathematician, and now a brutal murder made him entirely unfit to rule. The government applied crushing, relentless pressure on the prince. They cornered him, presenting him with the absolute ruin of his public image and the imminent threat he posed to the nation's security. On the 27th of March 1909, broken by the public outrage, abandoned by his political allies, and perhaps finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of his own actions, George surrendered. He signed the formal documents of abdication, officially renouncing his right to the throne of Serbia and passing the succession to his younger brother, Alexander. The Serbian government accepted the abdication with a speed that bordered on the indecent. But Prime Minister Pasic was a master of political manipulation, and he recognized a golden opportunity in the prince's downfall. The government was preparing to make a deeply humiliating concession to Austria-Hungary, officially recognizing the annexation of Bosnia and backing down from the brink of war. This capitulation would have triggered massive riots and potential revolution in the streets of Belgrade. To prevent this, the government weaponized George's abdication. They actively fueled the media frenzy surrounding the disgraced prince, ensuring that the newspapers were flooded with lurid details of his violent outbursts, his abdication, and his scandalous private life. The strategy worked flawlessly. The Serbian public became so entirely consumed by the sensational collapse of the crown prince that they barely noticed when the government quietly signed the humiliating treaty with Austria-Hungary. George's ruin was used as the ultimate smokescreen to mask a national defeat. Instantly, the shadow shifted. Alexander, the younger brother who had spent his life quietly observing George's chaotic implosion, stepped into the light. He was fundamentally different from George, cold, calculating, highly disciplined, and possessing a ruthless talent for political maneuvering. Alexander was immediately invested as the new crown prince. He looked upon his disgraced older brother not with pity, but with a cold, predatory pragmatism. The reality of what he had lost hit George with devastating force almost immediately. The anger subsided, leaving only the cold ash of regret. In the years that followed, specifically in 1921 and 1922, George would write desperate, pleading letters to the government and to his brother, attempting to retract his abdication, claiming he had been forced out under immense psychological duress. But the door to the throne room had been permanently bolted shut. Alexander, securing his grip on power, coldly and repeatedly ignored the pleas of the brother he had replaced. The crown was gone, leaving George a prince with no kingdom, a soldier with no war, and a man forever marked by the blood on his hands. The gilded doors of the royal palace were locked behind him, but the borders of Serbia were rapidly disintegrating into violence. Stripped of his royal mandate, politically radioactive, and socially isolated, George was left with only the brutal education he had received in the freezing courtyards of the Russian Page Corps. He was a man built for conflict, and the Balkans were about to erupt into a decade of relentless bloodshed. If he could not wear the crown, he would wear a uniform. He threw himself into the military, seeking either violent redemption or a glorious, fatal erasure on the battlefield. The opportunity for blood arrived with the outbreak of the First Balkan War in 1912, followed swiftly by the Second Balkan War in 1913. The Serbian army mobilized to drive the Ottoman Empire out of Europe, and then turned its guns on its former allies over the spoils of territory. While the newly minted Crown Prince Alexander remained closely tethered to the high command, safely managing the logistics of war and solidifying his political alliances, George rode directly to the front lines. He did not seek the sheltered existence of a royal observer in a rear echelon command tent. He commanded infantry units in the vanguard, living in the mud, eating the same meager rations as the enlisted men, and deliberately placing himself in the most heavily contested sectors of the front. His soldiers, initially suspicious of the disgraced, notoriously volatile royal, soon witnessed a terrifying display of military aggression. George fought with a reckless, almost suicidal bravery. He possessed an innate, predatory instinct for combat, leading charges directly into artillery barrages with a chilling disregard for his own survival. It was as if he was actively hunting for a bullet to wipe away the scandal of Stevan Kolaković's murder, using the blood of the enemy and his own to cleanse his ruined reputation. But the regional conflicts of the Balkan Wars were merely a prelude to the global catastrophe that George had violently advocated for years prior. In the summer of 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, seeking retribution for the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, unleashed a massive invasion of Serbia, igniting the First World War. The Serbian military, exhausted, outgunned, and vastly outnumbered, faced total annihilation. King Peter I, aging and physically frail, had already handed executive royal authority to Alexander, making the younger brother the Prince Regent and the de facto commander-in-chief of the Serbian armed forces. Alexander orchestrated the defense of the nation from the strategic headquarters, a monarch fighting a war on maps. George, however, was in the trenches, a commander facing the mechanical slaughter of early 20th century warfare face to face. The defining moment of George's redemption occurred in September 1914 during the harrowing Battle of Machkov Kamen. The fighting on the jagged, mountainous terrain of western Serbia was apocalyptic. The Austro-Hungarian forces launched relentless infantry assaults backed by overwhelming artillery fire, turning the rocky slopes into a meat grinder. The Serbian lines were buckling under the pressure. Casualties were catastrophic, and the morale of the defending troops was beginning to shatter. Commanding a battalion in the thick of the carnage, George recognized that the line was about to break. He did not issue orders from a reinforced bunker. Drawing his weapon, the disgraced prince climbed out of the trench and exposed himself entirely to the blistering enemy fire. He screamed for his men to hold the line and led a desperate, violent countercharge directly into the advancing Austro-Hungarian infantry. It was a moment of absolute blinding chaos. In the brutal close-quarters combat, George was hit. The injury was massive and immediately life-threatening. He was struck heavily, his body torn by enemy fire, and he collapsed onto the blood-soaked rocks of Machkov Kamen. The sight of the king's eldest son falling in combat sent a shockwave through the ranks. His men, galvanized by the sheer audacity of a prince, bleeding on the front lines beside them, held the line with fanatical ferocity. George was dragged from the kill zone by his soldiers and rushed to a rear field hospital. He hovered on the brink of death for weeks, his survival uncertain. Against all medical odds, George survived. But the man who eventually rose from that hospital bed was no longer the despised, homicidal maniac of 1909. The alchemy of war had fundamentally transformed him. Word of his reckless courage and his severe wounds spread through the decimated ranks of the Serbian army and echoed back to the civilian population. The public memory is famously short, and blood spilled in defense of the homeland possesses a unique absolute power to absolve past sins. The people of Serbia forgave him, the soldiers worshipped him. To the exhausted, battered population, George was no longer the violent prince who beat a servant to death in a fit of aristocratic rage. He was a living martyr, a man who possessed the wealth and connections to flee the country, yet chose to stand in the mud and take a bullet for Serbia. He became the physical embodiment of the nation's defiance against the Austro-Hungarian invasion. When he finally appeared in public, walking with a heavy limp and bearing the visible scars of Machkov Kamen, he was met with deafening cheers. He was a national hero, universally revered, This soaring, untethered popularity triggered absolute terror in the high command. Prince Regent Alexander watched his older brother's resurrection from headquarters with growing paranoia. Alexander had meticulously engineered his own rise to power, capitalizing on George's political suicide. He had spent years consolidating his grip on the military and the parliament, carefully projecting an image of stable, measured leadership. But Alexander understood the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of Balkan politics better than anyone. A ruling monarch relies on political legitimacy. A usurper relies on absolute control. Alexander knew that a highly popular, battle-tested military commander, who also happened to possess the blood right of the firstborn son, was a lethal threat to the crown. George was a loose cannon, deeply unpredictable, and now he had the unwavering loyalty of the combat veterans. If George decided to march on Belgrade to reclaim the throne he felt he was bullied into surrendering, the army might very well follow him. The abdication of 1909 had merely removed George from the line of succession. The Battle of Machkov Kamen had made him a king in the eyes of the soldiers. Alexander realized with a cold, terrifying certainty that his brother's rehabilitation was not a family triumph. It was a countdown to a coup. The state cover-up had saved George from the gallows in 1909, but his heroism in 1914 had signed his death warrant. Alexander decided, with the cold ruthlessness that would define his reign, that the hero of Machkov Kamen had to be permanently, cleanly, and legally erased from the world. The end of the First World War in 1918 did not bring peace to the Karađorđević dynasty. It merely shifted the battlefield from the muddy trenches of the Balkans back to the polished marble floors of the royal palace. Serbia emerged from the global slaughter not just victorious, but exponentially larger. The collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire allowed Belgrade to absorb vast swaths of territory, creating the sprawling, deeply fractured kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later known as Yugoslavia. Alexander, who had spent the war meticulously managing the political and logistical lifelines of the army, positioned himself as the grand architect of this new, massive state. When their frail father, King Peter I, finally died in 1921, Alexander was officially crowned king. He had achieved total, absolute power. Yet, sitting on his newly expanded throne, Alexander looked out at his kingdom and saw a single glaring vulnerability. His older brother, George, had survived the war. He had survived the catastrophic injuries at Machkov Kamen. He had returned to Belgrade not in disgrace, but trailing the heavy, undeniable aura of a combat veteran who had bled with his men. To the tens of thousands of demobilized soldiers crowding the cafes and public squares of the capital, George was their true commander. He was the prince who had climbed out of the trench. Alexander, despite his crown, was deeply insecure, acutely aware that his own military record was one of safe distance and administrative calculation. The existence of George in Belgrade was a constant, ticking political explosive. The older brother made no effort to hide his disdain for Alexander's cautious, often dictatorial style of governance. George still possessed his fierce, unpredictable temper, and he frequently engaged in loud, highly public arguments with government officials, openly criticizing the new regime's policies. For a king attempting to unify a deeply divided nation of different ethnicities and religions under an absolute monarchy, a popular, volatile, and legitimate alternative claimant to the throne living freely in the capital was entirely unacceptable. Alexander could not simply execute his brother. That would create a martyr and potentially spark an armed military uprising among the veterans. He could not exile him, as George might become a rallying point for foreign enemies or domestic dissidents. Alexander needed a method to permanently neutralize George that was completely legal, morally unassailable in the eyes of the public, and entirely irreversible. He decided to weaponize medicine. The strategy was chilling in its calculation. Alexander began a systematic campaign of psychological warfare designed to trigger the very volatility he planned to condemn. He deliberately isolated George, cutting off his access to state functions, restricting his military pension, and placing him under relentless surveillance by the secret police. Every conversation George had was monitored. Every movement was tracked. The pressure was designed to suffocate. George, a man who required physical freedom and who despised authority, reacted exactly as Alexander anticipated. Frustrated, cornered, and deeply paranoid about the constant surveillance, George's behavior became increasingly erratic. He lashed out at the royal guards, erupted in violent verbal tirades against the government, and retreated into periods of dark, brooding isolation. Alexander watched this deterioration with cold satisfaction. He did not send soldiers to arrest his brother. He sent psychiatrists. The king convened a highly classified medical board consisting of state-appointed physicians whose careers and lives depended entirely on royal favor. Their instructions were implicit but absolute. They reviewed George's history, deliberately highlighting the horrific, brutal murder of Stevan Kolaković in 1909, his history of physical assaults, and his recent surveillance-induced outbursts. They completely ignored his decorated military service and his capacity for deep, enduring relationships, such as his ongoing, quiet correspondence with the mathematician Mika Alas. The medical board delivered exactly what the king required. They diagnosed Crown Prince George with severe, incurable paranoia and violent schizophrenia. They declared him legally insane, an immediate and profound danger to himself and to the security of the state. In 1925, the trap snapped shut. There was no public trial, no opportunity for a defense, and no warning. In the dead of night, a detachment of royal guards, accompanied by medical personnel, arrived at George's residence. The man who had led infantry charges into artillery fire was overpowered, sedated, and quietly removed from the capital. He was transported far from Belgrade, deep into the Serbian interior, to a specialized psychiatric facility in Gornja Topanica, near the city of Niš. This was not a standard hospital designed for rehabilitation. It was a fortress retrofitted for a single, high-value political prisoner. George was locked inside a heavily barred suite, guarded around the clock by a hand-picked detachment of the king's most loyal gendarmes. The medical staff were explicitly forbidden from engaging in personal conversation with him. His mail was intercepted and destroyed. He was entirely cut off from the outside world. The government released a brief, sterile press bulletin announcing that, due to a tragic deterioration of his mental faculties, the former crown prince had been permanently confined for his own safety and the safety of the public. The erasure was absolute. Inside the borders of Yugoslavia, it became a tacit crime to speak of Prince George. Newspapers were forbidden from printing his name. Photographs of him standing alongside his brother or commanding troops during the war were quietly removed from public archives and state publications. It was a complete damnatio memoriae, a systematic deletion of a human being from the historical record, executed by his own flesh and blood. Inside the walls of Gornja Topanica, George was subjected to the most profound form of psychological torture, absolute sensory and social deprivation. A man defined by extreme physical exertion, a man who had fenced, ridden cavalry horses, and hauled heavy fishing nets from the freezing currents of the Danube alongside Mika Alas, was now confined to a few square meters of sterile space. The days bled into years of crushing, silent monotony. He was forced to endure the agonizing reality of possessing a completely lucid mind, trapped within an institution that insisted he was mad. He paced his cell, tracing the identical paths across the floorboards for hours on end, his immense physical energy turning inward, eroding his spirit. He wrote desperate, furious letters demanding an independent medical evaluation, demanding to be put on trial, demanding simply to speak to a lawyer. Every letter was collected by the silent doctors and immediately burned. The betrayal by his brother cut deeper than any bayonet wound he had received at Machkov Kamen. Alexander had not just stolen his throne, He had stolen his identity, his freedom, and his grip on reality. George was forced to listen to the distant sounds of a changing world through a barred window, knowing that the men he had commanded in battle were outside, living their lives, while he was slowly turning to dust in a cage built by his own family. For 9 years, George rotted in Gornja Toponica. The world moved on, hurtling toward the economic devastation of the Great Depression and the rising tide of fascism in Europe. King Alexander ruled Yugoslavia with an increasingly dictatorial grip, attempting to hold his fractured kingdom together through sheer force of will and secret police. Alexander believed he had definitively solved the problem of his older brother. The hero of Machkov Kamen was buried alive, safely forgotten. But history possesses a dark, deeply ironic sense of justice. On the 9th of October 1934, King Alexander I traveled to Marseille, France on a state visit. As his open-topped car rolled slowly through the crowded streets, a Bulgarian assassin aligned with Croatian separatists stepped out of the crowd, drew a Mauser pistol, and shot the king at point-blank range. Alexander, the architect of Yugoslavia, the man who had stolen a crown and buried his brother, bled to death in the back seat of a car in a foreign city. The news of the king's assassination eventually filtered through the thick walls of the asylum in Niš. For George, the death of his tormentor must have felt like a sudden, blinding ray of sunlight. The man who had signed the medical decrees keeping him imprisoned was dead. Alexander's son, Peter II, was only 11 years old, entirely too young to rule. Control of the kingdom passed to a regency council, headed by George's cousin, Prince Paul. George immediately began demanding his release. He argued, with absolute logical precision, that the medical diagnosis condemning him was a fabricated political weapon designed solely by the late king. With Alexander gone, the political necessity for his imprisonment was nullified. He demanded to be evaluated by independent international psychiatrists. He fully expected Prince Paul, a highly educated, cultured man who had spent years in Oxford, to recognize the profound injustice of the situation and immediately open the doors of Gornja Toponica. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the state apparatus. Prince Paul and the Regency Council received George's petitions and reviewed the files. They did not see a tragically wronged cousin. They saw a massive, terrifying political liability. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia in 1934 was infinitely more unstable than it had been in 1925. The country was violently tearing itself apart along ethnic lines. Croatian separatism was surging, and the shadow of Nazi Germany was growing rapidly in the north. The government was desperately trying to maintain order. Releasing George, a highly popular, volatile war hero who had just spent a decade being wrongfully imprisoned by the state, was the equivalent of throwing a lit match into a powder keg. If George were released and spoke publicly about his forced incarceration, it would destroy the carefully cultivated, heroic legacy of the assassinated King Alexander. It would expose the deep corruption of the royal court and the state medical establishment. Even worse, disgruntled military factions or political opportunists could rally around George, using him as a figurehead to launch a coup against the fragile regency. Prince Paul made a cold, clinical calculation that mirrored Alexander's pragmatism perfectly. The injustice done to one man was irrelevant when weighed against the survival of the regime. The regent quietly denied the petitions. George was condemned to watch the years slip away, a forgotten prince locked in the heart of the Balkans. As the 1930s drew to a close, the walls of Gornja Toponica continued their slow, agonizing erosion of his spirit. He had become a political ghost pacing the wooden floorboards, forced to listen to the faint echoes of a mobilizing Europe outside his barred window, legally classified as a madman, while the world outside prepared to drown itself in blood. The walls of Gornja Toponica offered a masterclass in the slow, agonizing erosion of the human spirit. As the 1930s drew to a close, Crown Prince George remained buried alive within his own country, a political ghost haunting a heavily guarded cell, while he paced the wooden floorboards, measuring his existence in meaningless, identical days. The continent beyond his barred window was rapidly accelerating toward the greatest cataclysm in human history. The Regency Council, terrified of his popular appeal and desperate to maintain their fragile grip on a deeply fractured Yugoslavia, had definitively sealed his fate. They calculated that allowing an angry, legitimate heir to roam free was a risk the state could not afford. George was condemned to total irrelevance. He was forced to listen to the faint, distant echoes of a mobilizing Europe, fully aware that the geopolitical tectonic plates were shifting, while he was legally classified as a madman and left to rot. The profound irony of George's existence was that the very state apparatus designed to secure the nation by imprisoning him was entirely incapable of securing itself. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia, meticulously assembled by his assassinated brother and forcefully maintained by Prince Paul, was structurally compromised, rotting from within due to fierce ethnic divisions and political corruption. When the storm finally broke, the royal government did not stand and fight. It disintegrated with terrifying speed. On the 6th of April 1941, the sky over Belgrade darkened not with rain clouds, but with the ominous silhouette of the German Luftwaffe. Adolf Hitler, enraged by a sudden anti-fascist coup in the Yugoslav capital that had overthrown a recently signed pact with the Axis, launched Operation Retribution. It was a campaign of absolute mechanized annihilation. German bombers relentlessly pounded the undefended capital, reducing the royal palaces, the government ministries, and the civilian neighborhoods to burning rubble. Simultaneously, a massive, multi-pronged ground invasion orchestrated by German, Italian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian forces smashed across the Yugoslav borders. The Royal Yugoslav Army, the institution George had once bled for at Mochkov Kamen, collapsed in a matter of days. It was severely outgunned, poorly led by generals appointed through political patronage rather than military competence, and paralyzed by internal ethnic sabotage. Recognizing that the war was lost almost before it began, the royal family and the government high command made a cold, desperate calculation. They gathered whatever state gold reserves they could carry, abandoned the burning capital, and fled the country, eventually establishing a government in exile in London. They left the civilian population to face the brutal reality of fascist occupation, and in their panicked, chaotic flight, they left behind the prisoner in Gornja Topanica. As the German Wehrmacht rolled relentlessly into the Serbian interior, the guards and medical staff at the psychiatric asylum outside Niš faced a critical decision. The state that paid their salaries no longer existed. The king had fled. The military was destroyed. Faced with the advancing columns of Nazi armor, the wardens of Gornja Topanica simply unlocked the heavy iron gates, abandoned their posts, and scattered into the countryside. When the German forces eventually arrived at the facility, expecting to find perhaps a pocket of resistance or a requisitionable hospital, they discovered a deserted asylum containing a handful of abandoned patients. Among them was the rightful heir to the shattered kingdom. The liberation of Crown Prince George of Serbia was not achieved by a heroic rescue mission launched by his family or his former comrades in arms. It was executed by the invading soldiers of the Third Reich. The German military intelligence apparatus, the Abwehr, and the Gestapo quickly realized the immense political value of the man they had stumbled upon. They possessed detailed dossiers on the Karađorđević dynasty and were acutely aware of George's history. His status as the firstborn son, his legendary military record in the First World War, his violent feud with the assassinated King Alexander, and his subsequent, highly suspicious imprisonment. To the Nazi occupation authority, George was not a psychiatric patient. He was a strategic asset. The Germans transported him out of the asylum and brought him back to the ruined streets of Belgrade. The capital he returned to was unrecognizable, a smoking, shattered shell governed by martial law, SS patrols, and the constant, terrifying threat of summary execution. Yet for George, stepping into this apocalyptic landscape marked his first taste of freedom in 16 years. The German command did not bring him to Belgrade out of a sense of humanitarian duty. They had a specific, deeply cynical objective. The occupation of Yugoslavia was proving to be a logistical nightmare, plagued by the immediate eruption of fierce, competing resistance movements, the royalist Chetniks and the communist partisans. The Germans needed to pacify the Serbian population quickly to free up troops for the impending invasion of the Soviet Union. Their strategy relied on establishing a pliant, collaborationist government, a puppet regime that could lend a veneer of local legitimacy to the brutal Nazi occupation. They approached George with a calculated proposition. They offered to restore his royal titles, grant him residency in an undamaged palace, and install him as the figurehead ruler of an occupied Serbian state. It was a Faustian bargain mirroring the arrangement the Nazis had struck with Vidkun Quisling in Norway or Marshal Pétain in Vichy, France. They offered him the crown that his brother had stolen, the ultimate revenge against the family that had locked him in a cage. They expected the angry, betrayed, and legally insane prince to eagerly accept the opportunity to humiliate the exiled King Peter II and reclaim his birthright under the protection of German guns. They fundamentally miscalculated the nature of the man. George possessed a famously volatile temper and a dark history of personal violence, but his loyalty to the concept of the Serbian nation and the men he had commanded in battle was absolute. He looked at the German officers offering him a kingdom built on the ashes of his countrymen and delivered a cold, unequivocal refusal. He would not act as a shield for fascist firing squads. He would not betray the memory of the soldiers who had dragged his bleeding body from the rocks at Machkov Kamen to serve as a puppet for the men who were currently occupying their homes. His refusal carried an immense, immediate risk. The Gestapo did not tolerate defiance, and George had no military backing, no wealth, and no political leverage. He was entirely at their mercy, a single order away from a firing squad or a one-way train ticket to a concentration camp. However, the German High Command assessed the situation with ruthless pragmatism. Executing a highly decorated, famously popular World War I hero would instantly inflame the local population and hand a massive propaganda victory to the royalist Chetnik resistance. Because George also firmly refused to align himself with any of the active resistance factions, maintaining a rigid, isolated neutrality, the Germans concluded he was politically inert. He was more useful to them alive and marginalized than dead and martyred. They placed him under strict surveillance, but allowed him to remain in the city as a private citizen. For the duration of the Second World War, the man who was born to rule the Balkans lived in extreme, quiet obscurity within the occupied capital. The former crown prince navigated the daily, grinding humiliations of wartime survival. He stood in the freezing rain in ration lines, trading meager possessions for bread and coal, surrounded by citizens who rarely recognized the aging, hardened man in the worn overcoat. He witnessed the horrific mechanics of the Nazi occupation firsthand, the public hangings in the squares, the mass deportations, the absolute terror of the Gestapo raids in the dead of night. He survived the brutal Allied bombing campaigns of 1944, which pounded Belgrade into rubble a second time, hiding in damp cellars, alongside the working-class families of the city. He lived a life stripped entirely of royal privilege, reduced to the absolute, primal baseline of human survival. The occupation finally shattered in the autumn of 1944. The Soviet Red Army, driving relentlessly westward, converged on Belgrade simultaneously with the hardened, battle-tested divisions of the Yugoslav partisans, led by the communist revolutionary Josip Broz Tito. The ensuing battle for the capital was a slaughter. Soviet armor and partisan infantry engaged in savage, building-to-building street fighting against the entrenched German defenders. George, trapped in the crossfire, weathered the artillery barrages and the urban warfare, watching the final destruction of the old world order from the shadows. When the smoke cleared and the last German units were annihilated or driven across the river, a new, formidable power structure clamped down on the city. The kingdom of Yugoslavia was dead, replaced instantly by a fierce, uncompromising communist regime. Tito and his partisans did not share power. They seized it absolutely. They moved with lethal speed to eliminate any political opposition, executing collaborators, suppressing the royalist resistance, and establishing a formidable secret police network, the OZNA, to enforce strict ideological conformity. The communist stance on the monarchy was definitive and merciless. The Karađorđević dynasty was declared the ultimate enemy of the people, a parasite class that had exploited the proletariat and then cowardly abandoned the nation to fascism. The new government formally abolished the monarchy, stripped every member of the royal family of their citizenship, permanently banned them from ever returning to Yugoslav soil, and confiscated all royal properties, bank accounts, and estates. The king in London was rendered a stateless exile. Anyone inside the country possessing direct ties to the old royal court was viewed with profound suspicion, subject to immediate interrogation, imprisonment, or execution in the brutal purges that swept the nation. It was within this terrifying atmosphere of revolutionary retribution that the communist secret police arrived at George's modest apartment in Belgrade. The officers of the OZNA found a man in his late 50s, living in near poverty, possessing no weapons, no wealth, and no political network. They detained him, subjecting him to the cold, analytical scrutiny of the new state apparatus. The communist leadership faced a unique ideological dilemma regarding the former crown prince. By all metrics of their revolutionary doctrine, George was a primary target, the eldest son of a king, a man of royal blood. Yet the intelligence files captured from the royal archives and the Gestapo headquarters told a different story. Tito, a master of political calculation, personally reviewed the bizarre trajectory of George's life. Tito did not see a threat. He saw the ultimate propaganda asset. George was a living, breathing indictment of the Karađorđević dynasty. Here was a man who had been brutally stripped of his rights, declared insane on fabricated charges, and locked in a cage for nearly 2 decades by his own brother, the supposedly glorious King Alexander. George had suffered under the tyranny of the monarchy just as the working class had. Furthermore, George had steadfastly refused to collaborate with the Nazis, denying the fascists a puppet king, which aligned him, at least tangentially, with the anti-fascist narrative of the partisan state. The communist government made a decision that shocked the exiled royal family and defied the standard operating procedure of revolutionary regimes. Defying standard revolutionary purges, Tito's government formally exempted George from the decree of banishment. Josip Broz Tito, the man who erased the Serbian monarchy, granted the former crown prince a state pension, the right to retain his residence in Belgrade, and the freedom to live out his days in the communist capital. It was a brilliant, deeply cynical maneuver. By treating George with calculated leniency, Tito demonstrated the supposed magnanimity of the new socialist state, while simultaneously validating his core argument. The old royal family was so fundamentally corrupt and vicious that they had even devoured their own. George was allowed to survive not out of mercy, but because his continued existence in a modest Belgrade apartment served as a permanent, humiliating monument to the cruelty and illegitimacy of the dynasty that Tito had overthrown. The man who had been a prisoner of the king was now a protected artifact of the Communist Party. The transition from a high-value political prisoner to a civilian pensioner under a strict Marxist-Leninist dictatorship was a surreal epilogue for a man whose birth was supposed to dictate the fate of millions. George Karađorđević, the man forged in the brutal academies of the Russian Tsar and destined to be King George I of Yugoslavia, became simply Citizen George. The communist state did not grant him a palace, nor did they banish him to the gutters. They allocated him a modest, unremarkable apartment in the center of Belgrade. He was issued a standard state pension calculated not by his royal bloodline, but strictly by his status as a disabled military veteran of the First World War. He walked the streets of the capital every day, a tall, imposing figure moving with a heavy, permanent limp, blending seamlessly into the gray, utilitarian uniformity of the communist bloc. To the citizens of Belgrade navigating the austere, heavily monitored realities of the 1950s, the sight of the old man was a walking paradox. The vast majority of the younger generation, educated in state schools that rigorously erased the achievements of the monarchy, did not recognize him. To the university students and the factory workers, he was just another quiet pensioner feeding pigeons in Kalemegdan Park or standing patiently in line for bread at the state bakery. But the older generation remembered. The aging men who had fought in the freezing trenches of Machkov Common, or the citizens who recalled the sensational, scandalous newspaper headlines of 1909, knew exactly who was standing next to them. They treated him with a complex mixture of quiet reverence and profound terror. Engaging in open, familiar conversation with a member of the banned royal family, even one officially sanctioned by Marshal Tito, was a lethal risk. The secret police, the UDBA, had eyes on every street corner and informants in every cafe. A misplaced word of royalist sympathy could result in immediate interrogation or a sentence in a political prison camp. George understood this unspoken, deadly boundary perfectly. He kept entirely to himself, maintaining a polite, impenetrable distance from the public, accepting his profound isolation as the final, unchangeable condition of his existence. He was a ghost permitted to haunt his own city, so long as he never spoke of the crown. In 1947, at the age of 60, George made a decision that signaled his absolute surrender of any lingering political ambitions and his quiet embrace of an ordinary life. He married. His bride was Radmila Radonjić, a woman originating from a respected Montenegrin family. Under the old regime, a marriage to a woman outside the ruling, aristocratic houses of Europe would have triggered a massive constitutional crisis and required parliamentary intervention. Under Tito's regime, it barely registered on the state's bureaucratic radar. Radmila was a quiet, fiercely loyal companion who offered George the one thing he had been violently denied his entire life: absolute domestic stability. She did not marry a crown prince. She married a broken, aging soldier who carried the invisible scars of a psychiatric asylum and the very real guilt of a murdered servant. Their marriage was deliberately quiet and remained childless. This biological dead end ensured that George's direct, legitimate bloodline would terminate with him, a biological reality that undoubtedly brought a profound sense of relief to the communist authorities who continuously monitored his every move. With his days stretching out in quiet anonymity, George turned his fiercely active mind inward, finally confronting the wreckage of his past. The state had violently stripped him of his future, but they could not confiscate his memory. He sat in his modest apartment and began to write. The result was a deeply personal, remarkably candid, and politically explosive autobiography titled The Truth About My Life. In a rigid authoritarian state where every piece of literature, journalism, and art was subjected to ruthless ideological censorship, the publication of a memoir by a former crown prince should have been a physical impossibility. The manuscript should have been seized and burned by the secret police. Instead, Tito's government recognized the devastating propaganda value of George's words. George's writings provided an unvarnished, insider account of the absolute moral bankruptcy of the Karađorđević dynasty. He wrote with bitter, surgical clarity about the stifling, paranoid, and treacherous atmosphere of the royal court. He detailed the vicious psychological warfare waged against him by his brother, exposing the assassinated King Alexander not as the glorious martyred unifier of Yugoslavia, but as a ruthless, calculating usurper who weaponized state psychiatry to eliminate a legitimate political rival. He laid bare the corruption of the ministers, the cowardice of the courtiers, and the absolute rot at the core of the monarchy. The communist censors did not suppress a single word of these attacks. They actively championed the book. The state publishing houses printed massive, heavily subsidized runs of the memoir, ensuring it was prominently displayed in every bookstore, university library, and workers' reading room across the country. George was finally granted a platform to speak, but only because his personal truth served as the ultimate ideological weapon for the regime that had destroyed his family. He was allowed to destroy his brother's legacy, provided it also destroyed the concept of the monarchy itself. Yet, buried beneath the heavy political utility of the text, the truth about my life contained a profound, bleeding, emotional confession. When George wrote about the years before the blood and the betrayal, he did not focus on the gold of the palace or the power of the military. He wrote extensively about the only true sanctuary he had ever known, the muddy, freezing banks of the river Sava, and the silent, unyielding loyalty of the mathematician, Mika Alas. In a society that demanded absolute conformity, George used his state-sponsored memoir to immortalize a love that had scandalized a kingdom. He recounted the days spent hauling heavy fishing nets, the brutal fencing matches, and the profound, unquestioned equality they shared away from the suffocating gaze of the court. He documented the agonizing moment of his abdication in 1909, writing with raw vulnerability about fleeing to the river in absolute disgrace, only to find the professor waiting for him in the mud. He carefully recorded the poignant detail of the ink pen resting on Mika's lapel, the silent vow of solidarity that had anchored George when his entire world collapsed. Mika Alas had not lived to see George's liberation from the asylum or his survival through the war. The brilliant mathematician, stripped of his university positions, his health broken, had died in Belgrade in 1943 during the darkest, most brutal days of the Nazi occupation. He died in poverty, while the man he loved was locked in a cage in the interior. Writing the memoir was George's final, public act of devotion to the man who had treated him as an equal when he was a terrifying prince, and who had stood by him when he became a despised pariah. By cementing Mika Alas in his writings, George ensured that their bond would outlast the vicious court rumors, outlast the murder of Stevan Kolaković, and outlast the total collapse of the kingdom itself. The publication of the memoir marked the end of George's public life. Having fired his final volley at his dead brother and erected a literary monument to his dead companion, he retreated entirely into the silence of his apartment. The violent, chaotic energy that had defined his youth, the rage that killed a servant, the courage that led infantry charges, the paranoia that paced a padded cell, finally burned itself out. He spent the 1960s watching the city of Belgrade transform around him. The rubble of the war was cleared away, replaced by the towering, brutalist concrete blocks of Tito's socialist vision. The Yugoslavia that George had fought for, the kingdom his family had built, was systematically paved over. He lived long enough to see his exiled nephew, the deposed King Peter II, die of liver failure in a hospital in the United States, a king without a country, buried in a foreign land. George, the outcast, the murderer, the madman, remained the last Karađorđević standing on Serbian soil. The sheer endurance of George Karađorđević's life became his final, most profound rebellion. He was a man born in the late 19th century, raised in a world defined by absolute monarchs, horse-drawn artillery, and rigid dynastic bloodlines. Yet, he lived deep into the 20th century, navigating an era of nuclear proliferation, the Cold War, and the space race. By the late 1960s, the former Crown Prince of Serbia was an absolute anachronism, walking the streets of a rapidly modernizing socialist state. The world he was forged to rule had not merely been defeated, it had been entirely eradicated. He was a living artifact of a dead civilization, breathing the air of a country that actively denied the validity of his past. His physical reality in his final years stood in stark, devastating contrast to the violent, explosive energy of his youth. The heavy, muscular frame that had once beaten Stevan Kolaković to death, the sheer physical power that had hauled massive fishing nets from the freezing currents of the Sava alongside Mika Alas, was systematically dismantled by time and old war wounds. The severe injuries he sustained during the infantry charge at the Battle of Machkov Kamen in 1914, wounds that had briefly transformed him into a national deity, now dictated his daily existence. He walked with a pronounced, heavy limp, leaning heavily on a cane to navigate the cracked pavements of Belgrade. The militant, aggressive posture drilled into him at the Russian Page Corps collapsed into the hunched fragility of an elderly man. He was trapped in a failing body, just as he had once been trapped in a psychiatric cell. But the physical decline was secondary to the absolute, crushing psychological isolation of his final decade. George was a man who possessed a terrifyingly lucid memory. He remembered the exact smell of the gunpowder during the 1903 palace coup. He remembered the specific political calculations that drove his father to warn him away from the riverbanks. He remembered the exact cadence of his brother Alexander's voice when the traps were laid for his imprisonment. By 1970, every single person who had participated in the defining moments of his life was dead. The victims were dead. The conspirators were dead. The executioners were dead. His brother Alexander had been assassinated decades prior. His beloved confidant, Mika Alas, had died in poverty during the Nazi occupation. His nephew, the deposed King Peter II, had succumbed to alcoholism and liver failure in American exile. Even the hardened soldiers who had cheered him on the front lines of the First World War had largely faded into the earth. George was left entirely alone, carrying the exclusive, unshared memory of a vanished kingdom. He possessed the burden of being the final witness to a century of Balkan bloodshed, a man forced to live silently with the ghosts of a dynasty that the rest of the country was deliberately trying to forget. The communist state apparatus, having successfully utilized his memoir as a weapon of propaganda, gradually lost interest in him. Marshal Tito's regime had firmly established its legitimacy on the global stage, successfully navigating a precarious independence between the Soviet bloc and the Western powers. The threat of a royalist restoration, which had terrified the communists in 1945, was completely extinguished by 1970. The Karađorđević family in exile was irrelevant, fractured, and powerless. Consequently, the heavy, overt surveillance that had tracked George's early years under communism slowly receded. The UDBA, the secret police, no longer viewed an octogenarian with a cane as a credible threat to the Socialist Republic. The state permitted him the dignity of being ignored. This bureaucratic apathy was, in many ways, the final insult. For a man whose entire life had been defined by his immense political gravity, a man whose temper could trigger a constitutional crisis, whose abdication was used to mask a national surrender, and whose very existence terrified a ruling monarch into weaponizing an asylum, becoming politically irrelevant, was the ultimate erasure. He was no longer a danger to anyone. He was just an old man collecting a veteran's pension, waiting to die in a modest apartment. His wife, Radmila, remained his sole anchor during this protracted ending. She provided a quiet, fiercely protective barrier between the aging prince and the outside world. She managed their modest state stipend, maintained the routines of their small household, and absorbed the heavy silences that increasingly dominated George's days. She bore witness to the night terrors and the sudden, dark moods that still occasionally surfaced, the residual echoes of the paranoia instilled during his decades in Gornja Topanica. Through her presence, George achieved a grim, heavily compromised version of peace. It was not the glorious, triumphant twilight of a monarch, but it was a definitive victory over the asylum that was meant to be his tomb. The end arrived quietly, devoid of the dramatic violence that had characterized his youth. On the 17th of October 1972, at the age of 85, George Karađorđević died in his apartment in Belgrade. his body simply gave out. There was no assassination, no battlefield charge, and no state conspiracy. The man who had survived exile, a world war, a brutal psychiatric imprisonment, a Nazi occupation, and a communist revolution died of old age in his own bed. The death of a crown prince traditionally halts a nation, but the passing of Citizen George in 1972 was managed with cold, transactional efficiency. Buried quietly in the Karađorđević dynastic mausoleum at Oplenac, he was locked in the dark with the ghosts of his oppressors. The communist state ceased printing his memoir, reverting to absolute historical amnesia. For decades, he was successfully reduced to a historical footnote, a nameless casualty of the brutal machinery of 20th century Balkan politics. When Yugoslavia shattered in the 1990s, the locked doors of the state archives were finally broken open. Modern psychiatric analysis of the asylum dossiers revealed a chilling truth. George was legally sane, a victim of political assassination via medical terminology. Simultaneously, the unearthing of police reports confirmed his lethal brutality against Stevan Kolaković, while his letters to Mika Alas exposed a profoundly humanizing sanctuary away from the palace. Ultimately, Crown Prince George cannot be cleanly categorized. His life exposes the absolute moral bankruptcy of absolute power, standing as a brutal reflection of a century that forged a prince to rule a kingdom, only to see his most profound achievement become simply outliving the institutions that tried to destroy him.